I stumbled across a conversation online recently that it felt less like a debate and more like a glitch in the matrix.
Oh,
Yeah. So on one side, you had a user, and she was using this really sharp, obvious sarcasm to make a fundamental point about logic.
okay.
Her whole point was, just because someone has a fancy title on their wall doesn't automatically make them right. She was mocking the whole idea that credentials can just replace actual evidence.
A pretty standard and correct critique of a logical fallacy.
Exactly. But then the expert entered the room. A user with a PhD right there next to her name.
I think I see where this is going.
So you'd naturally expect a scientist to come in and, I don't know, defend the scientific method, right? Talk about data, verification, peer review.
The very things that give the credential meaning in the first place.
But she didn't do any of that. Instead, she did something just baffling. She looked at that sarcastic joke, a joke specifically designed to mock the idea that status equals truth, and she unironically embraced it. Yes. She replied, and I'm quoting here, "On the subject I am an expert in." Yeah, that's kind of how it works.
Wow.
I mean, I had to read it 3 times to be sure. A credentialed academic looked at a textbook definition of the appeal to authority fallacy and just claimed it as her professional operating model.
She effectively argued that her degree, not her evidence, is what dictates reality.
Precisely. But the moment that really sent a chill down my spine wasn't her arrogance, it was the crowd.
The reaction.
I looked down at the engagement numbers and saw 58,000 likes.
58,000.
58,000 people looked at a statement that is undeniably anti-science and, well, logically broken, and they cheered for it.
Oh, well, that's chilling.
It made me realize that this isn't just some funny Twitter moment. It is a terrifying sign that a massive chunk of the population, and maybe even the experts themselves, have forgotten how truth actually works.
That observation, while alarming, I think it reflects something really profound and systemic. It's not just one person.
It can't be.
It highlights the core conflict we're facing in modern Western societies. This increasing prevalence of credentialism, that fancy title, that established position over genuine, rigorous, evidence-based reasoning.
Authority over evidence.
Exactly. And this isn't just about public trust declining. It's about how the elite class of academics and policymakers themselves are, in some cases, prioritizing their recognized authority, their status, over scientific fidelity.
Which is a complete inversion of the scientific ideal.
It is. When the messenger effectively claims their position supersedes the need for proof, what we're seeing is a deep, systemic breakdown in the integrity of knowledge itself.
That's why that anecdote felt like a gut punch. It's not just some random person distrusting science. It's the scientist essentially validating that distrust by behaving exactly how the critics accuse them of behaving.
She played right into the stereotype.
She became the stereotype. And if the very foundation of rational discourse seems to be shaking when experts start embracing the logical fallacy designed to critique them, we really need to understand the dynamics at play here.
We do.
So that's what this deep dive is all about. We're going to unpack the psychological, the political, and the educational factors that are driving this erosion of trust. And, more importantly, we're going to look for systemic solutions to re-embed evidence at the heart of our decisions, rather than just blind deference to a title.
To start, I think we have to look at the conceptual fight over what authority even means.
Right.
Especially in these critical fields like information literacy. There are really 2 major and often conflicting views about the nature of truth and, the source of expertise.
Okay, let's unpack that. So on one side, you have the foundational scientific ideal. Authority is tied directly to verifiable fact, to objective reality. A physicist's authority comes from repeatable experiments, from data that can withstand scrutiny. The evidence is what grants them the authority.
Yes, that foundational ideal is absolutely necessary for any kind of scientific or technical progress. But the competing view, and this is one that's gained a lot of traction since the mid-late 20th century, drawing heavily on critical theory, is the idea that authority is constructed and contextual.
Constructed and contextual. So the idea that what we call knowledge is often shaped by things like power structures and social norms.
Exactly. This perspective argues that what is considered true, or who is considered an expert, isn't always objective, but is instead a product of a specific culture or a specific power dynamic.
And this view, I think it often originates from a really honorable place. It's an attempt to uphold voices and cultural knowledge that have been historically marginalized by, say, Western academic structures.
It absolutely does. The intention is often to broaden our understanding of knowledge.
But it creates this immense tension with this scientific ideal.
It creates a massive tension. And the critical issue is that when we move into this kind of post-truth environment, this constructed view, which was intended to be a critique of existing power, can actually be weaponized by the ruling class.
How so?
Well, if you argue that all authority is merely contextual, then those in power can use that relativism to dismiss any inconvenient objective fact. They can just argue that all truth is simply a matter of perspective.
And that erodes the very concept of a shared reality that we need for civic life to even function.
Precisely.
So a politician or maybe a corporation that's facing uncomfortable data, let's say about climate change or product safety, can just claim that the scientific authority is constructed.
Yes, constructed by an elite liberal consensus or something along those lines.
And therefore, their perspective is equally valid. Wow. That's a really sophisticated way of denying reality while using academic language to do it.
It is. And that erosion is compounded by really profound confusion surrounding the term authority itself in the public sphere. We have to clearly distinguish between two very different concepts: cognitive authority and political authority.
Okay, cognitive versus political. Let's define those.
Cognitive authority is the recognition we grant to a person based on their expertise, their knowledge, their trustworthiness. It's the kind of authority a reputable scientist or scholar earns through peer review and demonstrable knowledge.
It's earned through proof.
It's earned. And political authority, that's about control, status, or power. Think of a government official, the police, or a manager who sets mandatory rules.
Right. That's the kind of authority we're often conditioned to resist because it regulates our behavior.
Exactly. And that's the practical challenge for a learner, or for any of us really. The common everyday association of the word authority is overwhelmingly skewed toward that political side control, hierarchy, institutional power.
Right. Think about the immediate visceral reaction a lot of people have when they get stopped by a police officer.
Or even just given an order by a supervisor at work.
There's an automatic resistance, a feeling of being controlled.
Precisely. So when students are told that cognitive authority, the expertise of a scientist, is necessary for successful knowledge production, they often experience a severe cognitive dissonance.
Because they're primed, socially and psychologically, to resist any form of authority.
They lump it all together. They associate it with being controlled or repressed, and that makes it significantly harder for them to recognize the legitimate earned expertise of, say, a doctor, an engineer, or a climatologist.
That distinction is so crucial, the one between resistance to control and resistance to knowledge. And it seems to me that this immediately impacts how we think about policy decisions.
Absolutely.
Which brings us directly to the policy backlash against what seemed like a really good idea: pure, unbiased decision-making.
Yes, the backlash against the evidence-based policy movement, or EBP. For decades, the mantra was that policies should be based on the best available evidence.
And the EBP movement often relied on a very rigid hierarchy of evidence, right? Which usually placed things like randomized controlled trials, RCTs, at the very top.
That's right. They were essentially trying to turn governing into a science.
So what was the critique? Because on the face of it, it sounds perfectly rational. I mean, we should only spend taxpayer money on things that are proven to work.
The critique was that this was naive rationality.
Naive rationality.
It incorrectly assumed that policymaking is just a technical exercise in decision science. That if you just gather enough data, the correct policy path will magically reveal itself.
But that's not how the world works.
Not at all. Policy is fundamentally a political struggle over competing social values. The EBP model fails most dramatically when it confronts what scholars call wicked problems.
Can you define wicked problems for us? It's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but it feels central to this whole critique.
A wicked problem is a social or policy issue that's characterized by extreme complexity. There's profound disagreement on both the definition of the problem and the definition of the solution.
And everything is interconnected.
Yes, complex interdependencies. Think about issues like systemic poverty, or climate change mitigation, or achieving racial equity.
So unlike a technical problem, like, say, designing a bridge, where you can definitively know if the bridge is going to hold or fall, a wicked problem doesn't really have a definitive answer or a stopping rule.
Exactly. There's no objective scientific metric for equity. You can't just run an RCT to determine the perfect level of social justice.
That makes sense.
Because these problems are inherently contested, they involve multiple stakeholders with profoundly different values and objectives. Policies that respond to them can't be meaningful, correct, or false. They can only be better or worse compromises.
So the search for a purely scientific, evidence-based solution for these wicked problems is, what, bound to fail?
It's bound to fail if it ignores the fact that politics is fundamentally about allocating resources and defining our collective values.
It sounds like the EBP movement was trying to use science to escape the difficulty of politics.
Which is impossible.
Yeah. You're basically arguing that trying to strip that political element out and replace it with pure evidence is just a technocratic wish in a political world.
That's the essence of the critique. And when you acknowledge the policy is driven by politics, you suddenly understand why evidence so often gets misused. The evidence isn't failing the policy. The political process is strategically using or ignoring the evidence to serve its own value-driven ends.
That shift in perspective is huge. Moving from judging policy against pure evidence to judging policy as a political struggle, it's essential for understanding how bias operates.
It is.
Because it forces us to look at the misuse of evidence not as some kind of accidental error, but as a violation of one of two really crucial political scientific principles.
Precisely. We can categorize the misuse of evidence into two distinct normative principles that reflect that political reality of policy processes. The first is the principle of fidelity to science.
And the second?
The principle of democratic representation. When evidence misuse occurs, it violates one or sometimes both of these principles.
Okay, let's start with the first one, technical bias. This is a violation of fidelity to science. So this means the evidence itself is distorted, manipulated, or just interpreted in an unscientific way.
Right. This is the more cynical and maybe more obvious form of bias.
And what do we see here?
We see two primary mechanisms. First, there's creation bias, where the research itself is strategically designed to produce favorable, often predetermined results.
The historical playbook of the tobacco industry is the classic and very dark example of this, isn't it?
It's the textbook case.
And we're not just talking about simple funding bias here, where a study gets money from a certain interest group. This sounds like it's manipulation that's baked right into the methodology.
It's so much deeper than just funding. Internal documents from companies like Philip Morris revealed that their researchers were strategically designing studies to be underpowered.
Underpowered? What does that mean in practice?
It means the study sample size was deliberately too small, or maybe the duration of the study was too short, to reliably detect a statistically significant finding of harm.
So they were setting the experiment up to fail from the start.
Exactly. They could then publish the results and claim our study found no significant link between X and Y.
Yeah.
And by doing so, they could sow doubt about already established harms. It's a calculated effort to manufacture uncertainty.
That is a direct, cynical manipulation of the scientific method for corporate profit, using science to create a smokescreen, literally and figuratively.
And we see continuous accusations leveled against other industries as well, notably the pharmaceutical industry, regarding selective data reporting.
So hiding unfavorable clinical trial results.
Or strategically manipulating research protocols to minimize negative outcomes. This isn't science serving truth, it's science serving a balance sheet, and it fundamentally violates that principle of scientific fidelity.
Okay, so the second form of technical bias is interpretation bias. And this one feels incredibly effective because it relies on confusing the public and policymakers with statistics.
Yes. The classic and highly impactful example here is the misinterpretation of risk statistics.
Right.
This is a technique used ubiquitously in public health debates, and it hinges on leveraging the difference between absolute risk and relative risk.
Okay, let's break this down because this is so important. Absolute risk is simple, right? It's just the actual chance of something happening to a person.
Correct. If 1 in 100 people get a disease, the absolute risk is 1%. Simple. Relative risk, however, compares that chance between two different groups, and it's usually expressed as a dramatic percentage increase.
This can sound abstract. Can you give us a concrete example that really shows the massive difference in implication?
Sure. Let's go back to that study on sugar-sweetened beverages. A headline might scream, "Consumption associated with an 18% increased risk of type 2 diabetes."
Okay, and to a normal person listening, that 18% sounds like a massive threat.
It does. Many people internalize that as, if I drink this, I have an 18% chance of getting diabetes. That perception is designed to shock.
But the reality, when you measure it by absolute risk, is far less dramatic, though still important.
Precisely. Let's say the baseline absolute risk for developing type 2 diabetes in the general population over a given period is 10%. So 1 in 10 people.
Okay.
An 18% increased relative risk only means the absolute risk rises from 10% to 11.8%.
So wait, it's an 18% increase of that original 10%?
Exactly. It's a difference of only 1.8 percentage points. Now, that's not nothing, but it's a very different picture. Policy decisions made based on that sensationalized 18% relative risk figure rather than the small 1.8% absolute risk change are based on a technically biased interpretation. It's designed to maximize political impact, not scientific accuracy.
This is a perfect illustration of how adherence to scientific fidelity can be completely warped by statistical framing.
It happens all the time.
So let's move to the second principle, issue bias. This violates democratic representation because it prioritizes certain social concerns over others, and it shifts the political debate in a way that isn't transparent.
Issue bias starts at the very beginning of the process, with resource allocation. The money. The choice of what issues to study is a fundamentally value-based exercise. When research funds are allocated, it's a political statement about what we as a society care about.
So a good example would be in the global health arena, where the big three, HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria, have historically received the lion's share of funding.
They absolutely have. And this leaves other issues like what are called neglected tropical diseases chronically under-researched.
So when policymakers say they can't address them because there's no evidence of effective intervention.
The lack of evidence is a direct result of a political choice about funding priorities. It's not a scientific failure. The issue itself is biased because the field of vision for our research is biased from the start.
So the absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence. That's a huge logical trap that just allows the political status quo to remain unchallenged.
Exactly. And the second critical dimension of issue bias is outcome measurement.
So choosing which outcomes define success.
Right. When you're evaluating controversial policies like, say, harm reduction centers, such as the Insight Clinic in Vancouver, supporters tend to focus on outcomes that are technically sound and measurable.
Things like reduced needle sharing, fewer visible syringes in public spaces, and lower overdose mortality rates.
All clearly valid health outcomes.
But policy decisions aren't just about health, are they? They're about competing social values.
That's the core of the issue. Opponents of those facilities often have different but still legitimate political concerns. They might view drug use through a lens of criminality or morality or social order.
So their concerns might be about the program sending the wrong message, or the potential for crime to be displaced into adjacent neighborhoods.
Or even the perceived diversion of funds from law enforcement. By constructing an evaluation that measures success only against health risks and excludes the political and social concerns of the opponents, the evaluation itself introduces bias. It's declaring certain democratic concerns to be unimportant or irrelevant to the policy decision.
This really shows how the line between a technical distortion and a political agenda is just incredibly blurry.
It is.
And when that political contestation is high, the incentive to manipulate the evidence is just stronger, which blurs the lines between the two types of bias even more.
Absolutely. When a policy decision affects, say, massive corporate profits or an election campaign, strategic appeals to evidence become purely rhetorical.
We saw this with Japan Tobacco International, or JTI, right? They campaigned fiercely against UK legislation that required plain packaging for cigarettes.
They did. They spent a significant amount of money on advertisements, claiming the proposal was not evidence-based.
The irony there is just, it's incredibly rich, given the long history of the tobacco industry systematically undermining scientific consensus.
It's astounding. JTI strategically used the language of the EBP movement, not evidence-based, to argue against a policy that would hurt their profits, even though their own scientific history is just rife with manipulation.
It highlights how appeals to evidence can become a cynical, rhetorical device used to protect vested interests.
And that's when you see it driving both technical distortion and issue selection bias. When the stakes are high, evidence is treated as a strategic weapon, not a guiding light.
We've spent a lot of time on these external political and economic pressures, but now we really have to turn inward. We have to face the inconvenient truth that the system is also undermined by human cognition itself.
That's right.
Cognitive science teaches us that we are all inherently, predictably irrational.
This is a fundamental paradigm shift away from that old Enlightenment ideal of Homo economicus, the perfectly rational actor who always processes information logically.
Which we now know is just not true.
Not even close. In reality, our decisions are often made using fast thinking, or what psychologists call System 1. It's quick, it's intuitive, it's emotional, and it relies heavily on heuristics.
Mental shortcuts.
Right, mental shortcuts we develop to help us navigate a complex world quickly.
And System 1 thinking is great for, say, avoiding danger or recognizing a familiar face instantly. But it's terrible for complex, multivariable analysis.
Precisely. Rational, analytical, evidence-based thought requires slow thinking, or System 2, and that demands immense mental effort. We are, by nature, cognitively lazy, and we tend to default to the path of least resistance.
And this human tendency to distort information to fit our existing narratives, this isn't a modern discovery, is it?
Not at all. Francis Bacon was categorizing these errors as early as the 17th century with his Idols of the Tribe. He acknowledged our fundamental tendency to see patterns where there are none and to support information that reinforces our worldview.
But the most potent and maybe the most destructive force in modern discourse has to be motivated reasoning. This is where the cognitive monster truly comes alive.
Motivated reasoning is the unconscious tendency to process, filter, and interpret new information in a way that aligns with our existing, deeply held beliefs, values, or goals.
And the key word there is unconscious. It's not necessarily a conscious choice to lie or ignore facts.
Not at all. It's an unconscious drive to reach a preset, comfortable conclusion.
Everyone sort of understands confirmation bias, searching for information that supports what you already believe. But you've suggested that the critical component here is something deeper. Identity protection.
This is the engine of so much of the social media polarization we observe today. When a piece of evidence or a policy proposition threatens a core belief that's associated with a person's social, political, or ideological group,
Or tribe.
their tribe, they are unconsciously motivated to resist that empirical assertion. And why? Because accepting the evidence could mean risking expulsion or marginalization from their community.
So it becomes an act of identity self-defense.
It does. For many people, being right is secondary to belonging.
This explains why 58,000 people cheered for that academic claiming authority trumped evidence. The approval wasn't about verifying her PhD.
Of course not.
It was about group affirmation. It was a cheer that said, "We believe in our tribe's messenger, therefore she is right, and the rules of logic don't apply to us."
And critically, this cognitive distortion isn't limited to the lay public. Experts are highly susceptible to it.
Especially when their values or their careers or even national security goals are intensely high stakes.
Exactly. We saw this play out on a geopolitical scale with the intelligence failures leading up to the 2003 Iraq War.
That remains one of the most sobering examples of high-level motivated reasoning. How did so many highly credentialed officials misread the evidence so fundamentally?
Officials in both the U.S. and the U.K., including key figures in Tony Blair's government, were driven by what we'd call an affective desire. It was an emotional, value-based commitment to removing Saddam Hussein and confirming that he possessed weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs.
So they had their conclusion before they had the evidence.
The conclusion was the mission. The evidence they received was often inconclusive, it was speculative, or is based on single, often dubious sources. But instead of subjecting it to that slow, rigorous, skeptical System 2 analysis, they processed it all through System 1.
They assessed inconclusive evidence as conclusive proof. They saw what they wanted to see.
Precisely. Lord Butler, who authored the key British report that investigated these intelligence failures, later concluded that the officials had, in his words, misled themselves.
Misled themselves. That's powerful.
It suggests it wasn't necessarily a massive, deliberate conspiracy to fabricate lies, but a systemic failure of confirmation bias. The intelligence community, driven by the strong political will of its leaders, cherry-picked the information that supported the preset narrative that Saddam possessed WMD capabilities.
And they simultaneously discounted or just ignored the contradictory evidence?
They did. Former UN weapons inspector Hans Blix observed that they were not critically thinking. They wanted to come to these conclusions.
So if the government wants a particular answer, to go to war, for instance, the analysts, even those who are rigorous professionals, can unconsciously filter the incoming data to satisfy that political and effective goal.
Yes. They're defending their organizational identity and their government's political objectives. This example shows that credentialing and intelligence expertise offer absolutely no insulation against these fundamental human cognitive flaws.
Especially when those flaws are amplified by high-stakes political urgency and shared ideological beliefs. It's the ultimate failure of expertise.
Yes.
And it highlights the urgent need for institutional checks on irrationality, because we can't simply train motivated reasoning out of the human brain.
We can't eliminate it, but we can design systems that anticipate it and counteract it. The challenge isn't eliminating the fact that democracies may, at times, have a political right to ignore evidence.
What do you mean by that?
Well, a democracy might choose to ignore strict cost-effectiveness for deeply emotionally salient issues, like, say, funding childhood cancer research. That's a political choice. The goal, rather, is designing institutional structures, rules, and procedures that make the irrational uses of evidence less likely and, critically, ensure that when irrationality does influence policy, it is transparent to the public. The system has to be stronger than the cognitive monster.
So if the problem is systemic, it's cognitive failures compounded by political and institutional bias, then the solution has to be systemic too. And it has to start right at the beginning with education.
It has to.
We have to teach the next generation how to navigate a world where expertise is under attack and data is being weaponized.
We absolutely do. And the Program for International Student Assessment, or CISA, provides an excellent blueprint for this kind of educational shift. The whole PISA framework emphasizes moving away from rote memorization of superficial content.
Just memorizing facts for a test.
Right, and moving toward cultivating deep learning and the application of scientific knowledge in real-world contexts.
The old model focused entirely on the facts. The new model has to focus on judgment.
That's it, exactly. PISA specifies 3 types of knowledge that are crucial for scientific literacy. First, there's content knowledge. That's the traditional facts, concepts, and theories we learn in school.
Okay.
Second, there's procedural knowledge understanding standard scientific procedures. How to measure, how to control variables, how to calculate statistical significance.
These 2 are necessary, of course, but alone they just train good lab technicians. They don't create informed citizens.
They're insufficient to address this crisis of authority. The true game changer is the third category, epistemic knowledge.
Okay, so can you break that down for us? What exactly is epistemic knowledge?
Epistemic knowledge is the deep understanding of how knowledge is justified, why certain methods are used, and the standards by which scientific claims are validated.
So it's like the metacognition of science. It's knowing the rules of the game.
Exactly. It involves understanding the rationale for common scientific practices, the status of different knowledge claims. Is this a hypothesis, a theory, or a consensus? And the crucial roles of consensus and peer review.
And most importantly, knowing how to critically judge the credibility of experts.
Yes, that's the key.
This is the specific tool that directly addresses the vacuum that was exposed by our opening anecdote. It stops the listener's reflex to just defer to a fancy title.
And instead, it forces them to apply judgment to the system that produced the claim.
Right.
A student equipped with epistemic knowledge understands that the scientific community's vetting process, its consensus and peer review, is what determines trustworthiness, not the credentials of a single, often contrarian voice.
PISA has a new competency that reflects this, right?
Yes, it's explicitly defined as research, evaluate, and use scientific information for decision-making and action. This requires media literacy and the ability to act as a critical fact-checker in real time.
Let's use the PISA example explicitly. How would they test a student's ability to navigate, say, the climate change information war?
They present scenarios. A student might be asked to identify the most trustworthy sources regarding the cause of global temperature increases.
And they're given several options.
Typically, yes. Options like an article published in a glossy energy company magazine versus an article in a peer-reviewed scientific journal summarizing the consensus amongst international climate scientists versus, say, a prominent politician's interview on cable news.
And the correct answer doesn't require knowing the melting point of ice. It requires knowing the mechanisms of verification.
The student has to understand that the peer-reviewed scientific journal, the one representing the established consensus, is the most credible source. And why? Because that knowledge has been subjected to rigorous scrutiny by scientific rivals, the methodology is transparent, and the findings are synthesized by the entire community.
So this kind of education actively combats the appeal to authority fallacy. It substitutes blind credentialism with an understanding of institutional vetting.
That's the goal.
Education is foundational, but the systems of governance also need to change. How do we ensure that policy systems advised by experts actually use evidence appropriately, acknowledging that political reality we discussed earlier?
We need to build robust evidence advisory systems. The focus has to move from training perfect individuals to building accountable institutions. The goal is the good governance of evidence, and it starts with defining what good evidence for policy even means. And crucially, it must be appropriate.
Appropriate contextually. So this means we have to abandon that rigid RCTs are always best hierarchy, right?
Absolutely. Appropriate evidence must, first, address the multiple political concerns at hand. If a new transportation policy affects air quality, economic feasibility, and community displacement, the evidence used has to speak rigorously to all three of those dimensions.
Not just the one that is easiest to quantify, like travel time efficiency.
Exactly. Second, it must be constructed to serve policy needs, meaning it has to be actionable, not merely academic.
Okay.
And third, it has to be applicable to the local context, meaning a social intervention that shows great results via an RCT that was conducted in a high-resource European capital may be completely inappropriate for a low-resource rural community in a different hemisphere.
Because of cultural or infrastructural differences?
Precisely. This ensures that evidence is both high quality and highly relevant to the values and constraints that are being contested by the democratic process.
And this brings us to the necessity of democratic legitimacy within these advisory systems.
Yes. When building these structures, you need input legitimacy. The system has to be designed by agents who have a public mandate, and we must always ensure that final decision authority rests with elected representatives who are accountable to the public.
Experts advise, politicians who are accountable to the electorate decide.
That is the essential political safeguard. If experts had the final say, we would live in a technocracy, not a democracy.
Right.
And we can see the tension between the scientific rigor and democratic demand play out perfectly with the UK's National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE.
NICE is world-renowned, right? They rigorously evaluate clinical treatments and pharmaceuticals based on these strict, scientifically derived cost-effectiveness thresholds.
They do, often using a metric called quality-adjusted life years, or QALYs. Their methodology is scientifically sound, and they adhere strictly to scientific fidelity. They're a model of technical expertise.
Okay, but what's the problem?
Well, the problem is that NICE often recommended against funding very expensive, cutting-edge cancer drugs.
Why?
Because, based on their rigorous analysis, those drugs did not meet the established cost-effectiveness thresholds. This caused a massive public outcry and political pressure.
Because cancer treatment is so deeply emotionally salient.
It is. The public felt their government was withholding life-saving treatment based on spreadsheets.
So how did the government respond to this tension between the expert science and the public's values?
The UK government eventually established the Cancer Drug Fund, the CDF. It was a parallel funding mechanism that bypassed NICE's scientific technocracy entirely.
Specifically to fund some of the drugs NICE had rejected.
Yes. And this demonstrates that democracy requires the political ability to override expert scientific advice when perceived social values shift. Overriding the expert was not an irrational act. It was an act of democratic legitimacy. It was necessary to maintain public faith in the political system, even if it meant sacrificing some degree of scientific cost-effectiveness rigor.
That's a fantastic distinction. Overriding expert advice, as long as it's transparent, can actually be a necessary mechanism for the political system to respond to changing values.
Which leads us to the final institutional requirements: contestability and transparency. We need non-state institutions that can act as bulwarks against bias and ensure multiple perspectives are vetted. We rely heavily on institutions like the National Academies of Science.
What specific role do the National Academies play here?
They provide consensus statements on high-stakes, politically charged issues like climate change or gene editing. This is critical because it moves the debate away from cherry-picking one or two dissenting voices to challenging the aggregated knowledge of the global scientific community.
So, for instance, a collective of 11 national academies from around the world issued a joint statement to clarify the scientific consensus that climate change is real and human-caused.
That acts as a robust baseline. If a politician denies that, they aren't just arguing with one scientist. They are arguing with a globally vetted consensus.
And that raises the political cost of scientific denial.
It does. And similarly, independent fact-checking projects serve a crucial role in deterrence. While studies show that fact-checking sometimes struggles to correct deeply ingrained public misperceptions.
It's hard to change someone's mind once it's made up.
It is. But it has been proven highly effective in reducing the incidence of misstatements by politicians in the first place. The threat of scrutiny forces decision-makers to justify their claims, and that reduces technical bias. The entire system has to be designed for accountability, ensuring evidence can be contested and scrutinized without dissolving the necessary concept of scientific truth. Ultimately, the modern crisis of expertise and this increasing prevalence of credentialism over verifiable evidence stems from a dual failure. It's a failure of our educational system to cultivate the necessary epistemic tools for citizens, and it's a failure of our governance institutions to successfully embed the principles of scientific fidelity and democratic representation at the same time. So we need to move beyond viewing evidence as this purely technical, objective metric.
And accept that technical rigor must be balanced by appropriate context and political accountability.
So being truly well-informed in the 21st century it's just far more complex than knowing a bunch of facts.
Much more. It requires possessing the epistemic tools to evaluate whether the evidence system, the consensus, the peer review, the methodology justifies the conclusion even when the messenger is wearing the cloak of a PhD.
Right.
It means recognizing our own human tendency toward motivated reasoning and actively demanding transparent, accountable governance from the institutions that advise our leaders. The goal isn't to destroy expertise.
Not at all. It's a guided evolution towards systems where evidence can be contested and scrutinized, reinforcing the concept of truth rather than letting the necessity of expertise destroy public trust.